Okay, so in this next part of the lecture, we're going to introduce you to the sociology of crime, which primarily is about understanding, I guess, the theories and concepts behind what crime is as a social, cultural, and historical phenomena to help us make sense of what's happening currently and how it's linked to previous times. So the first concept we're going to have a look at is the one of deviance. So that's a really foundational concept in sociology broadly and one that's widely used to understand, I guess, or frame what crime really is, because it, of course, does change over time. Our definitions and meanings of crime are usually tied to those of deviance. So, yeah, do you want to talk us through this, Steve?
Yeah, I mean, deviance is just like, yeah, definitely an eye of the beholder, changes to time and place. Um, Elvis shaking his hips on TV in the 50s was seen as deviant, like it's not so much now. It's pretty seen as kind of light entertainment these days. So, um, Becker's work on this is particularly important because it kind of highlights how power very much defines what's deviant. More accurately, powerful people get to define what's deviant, often based on the things that they kind of see as moral or good or ethical, but more often than not reflects their own interests and their own lifestyles and their own wants and needs. So Becker's work in particular, I think, highlights the famous quote for Becker is that the deviant is one whom the label has successfully been applied. Deviant behavior is behavior that people so label. It's kind of, and you can think of this across a bunch of different spectrums, right? Drug taking's a good one, so a doctor can prescribe you drugs. It's not taking drugs that's deviant. It's particular kinds of them in particular kinds of places.
Yep.
Even illegal drug taking is kind of policed and thought of differently. So people on the street are kind of treated much differently than, say, rich professionals taking cocaine in their house parties or whatever. So while they're both illegal, the understanding of whether it's deviant or not, or who would see one as more deviant than the other, is very contextual on time and place and who we're talking about here. And deviance tends to be labelled on the less powerful, on the racialized, on the poor. Um, yeah,
Yeah, that's right. So this is sort of some broader context on this theorization of deviance. So they'll often talk about the different, I guess, aspects or ways that this can be broken down to look at specific situations. So it will be often around trying to look at what the situation is around, such as peer group pressure, framing, say, again, drug taking or other kind of youth risk-taking behaviours in quotation marks,
yeah,
structural opportunities, such as those that I guess frame young people's lives more broadly, those that they, don't choose, the circumstances of their lives that just are happening around them, and cultural factors too. This can be definitely seen in relation to the gendered patterns of expectations for behaviour around men and women that will sort of legitimize and encourage certain kinds of potentially deviant or risky behavior. And for men, whereas it seems sort of less often permissible for young women to engage in some of those behaviors. So all these kinds of factors are really important for, I guess, applying what deviant theories are useful in relation to criminology or sociological perspectives of crime.
yeah, that's right. And situational stuff's really important. And subculture um, studies are a really good example of this. These subcultures around punk and stuff like that, kind of seen as deviant, but really they're just kind of people expressing their creativity. That's the kind of Birmingham school version of it. And the Chicago school back in the 50s, looking at kind of gangs and stuff like that in the US, showed that, like, um, it's not just deviance we need to consider here, it's people's idea of what normality is. If you go up in a particular situation where things around you are a particular way, you're much more likely to kind of follow those examples. Violence is a particularly good thing, I think, to look at through notions of deviance. You can be a
Mm.
hero if you're a soldier and you're sent overseas to kill people. But if you're, like, part of a gang and you're kind of doing it, within a kind of criminal syndicate and in terms of relations to other gangs or whatever, it's kind of seen as crime and a deviance. Now, I'm not kind of make a moral equivalence between the two things there, but when I do shoots on these kind of things, it's very rare that, like, I'm yet to find anyone come up with something that, like, can't be seen as kind of good or bad in different circumstances. Um, So again, it's very much the kind of contextual time and place thing that kind of is important here. And so the way we're interested in understanding from a sociological perspective is like, how do people kind of get socialized into these positions where they're more likely to kind of take on certain kind of behaviors on dispositions than others that are therefore labeled deviant? We tend not to blame the individual and look at wider kind of societal reasons about why things are happening.
Exactly. And like, labeling theory goes hand in glove with deviance theory, as you would have seen with the quote from Becker. Deviance is a label, successfully applied. Um, Again, this helps to sort of break down and make more useful or specific how these framing concepts work. So again, it's about the particular framings or names that we give particular behaviours in those particular circumstances. So it really is useful to look at specific examples, and you'll have an opportunity to do this as we go on through the course and look at the next few weeks, and in relation to some of your assignments, to look at the way these things operate in relation to a particular case study is particularly useful, I think.
Yeah,
Um, yeah,
yeah. And like it's good to think about deviance in terms of who and how and when people get sanctioned for it or not. Because it's probably rare that any of us go through the day without doing something that could be deemed deviant in one situation or another. Like broke a road rule or jaywalked or, these kind of things are kind of, you kind of get off scot-free for most of those things, probably unless you're, again, a racialized person, who might be targeted for those kind of things. So it's a bit of a the labeling thing is important here in youth studies in particular because people that are from marginalized backgrounds that often are exposed to kind of policing at an earlier age are more likely to can these kind of interventions in their lives where they feel that they've been labeled as deviant and therefore they take that stuff on into their identity and who they become and how they interact with others in the future. So this again is a really important understanding to think about how stigma um, becomes central to kind of how people experience in the world. And if you're positioned as an outsider, you therefore are very likely if that's happening at a young age, to therefore take that into who you are and kind of then perform that as yourself throughout your life. And the deviance thing is, in particular, I think is a good thing to think about, say, jail. Um, we have these kind of stereotype understandings that jail's a place where people go get punished and rehabilitated, but no one really kind of comes out of jail often better than they were when they went in, right? You see kind of stories of people, writing novels or starting charities because they found themselves in there or whatever. But for the most part, a jail is somewhere where people go to kind of learn to be a better criminal. Because you're surrounded by that kind of stuff. You're institutionalized in that kind of Goffman-esque kind of total asylum kind of situation. So again, from the sociological perspective, we're trying to make the normal look strange here and really get a bit more of an understanding how structures and institutions um, influence how people become who they are, whether that's, normal in inverted commas, which is probably no such thing as normal, to deviant.
yeah, exactly. And like, this is what kind of comprises the sociology of crime or criminality because it's always so contextual.
Yeah, and so we're looking at a particular kind of criminology, the social criminology here from a kind of critical perspective. There's lots of criminology that's kind of much more conservative, though I would argue actually blames individuals, kind of voluntaristic kind of notions. What we're looking at in this course is a very much more critical, engaged criminology.
Yeah. That's right. And so, in terms of the sociology of youth that we've introduced to you already, another framing that we can introduce here for how to think about, or I guess problematize what crime is around, crime is something that's so defined in its social and cultural setting. There are particular contours of crime in relation to youth. Because of how young people and children are sort of situated in their social and cultural contexts. So obviously socialization is really important here. It's also important to look at I guess, yeah, those framing contextual aspects of young people's lives that they don't choose, the world they're born into, and the kind of micro relations that inform their daily lives as they're growing up as being really important here to understand the process and I guess historical social formation of youth and crime together.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, the pushing boundaries rite of passage thing is an important thing to think about in terms of that youth transitional period as that kind of liminal thing of becoming one thing, but being one thing and becoming another. Everyone kind of goes through it in different ways. Often, in the general kind of mainstream thought about this, it's, young people have their first drink, or they experiment with drugs with their peers, or they, go out and party and, it's kind of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, or it's risk taking kind of stuff, cars and that kind of thing. It's kind of where, in that socialization process, you're kind of learning who you are and what you want to be and who you want to be around, and this has obvious influences on what you become. Again, a lot of what I find interesting about this is almost everyone at some point throughout this period will like do something wrong. They'll get too drunk and spew in someone's lounge room, or they'll all these kind of things. So it's just kind of part of kind of that rite of passage from being a child to adult. Importantly, again, from these perspectives, is that some people get a more free rite of passage, a bit more autonomy than others. That if you're more privileged, you can probably make a few more mistakes, and you have the support, or those around you who can help you if you make a mistake. Those with less support or more marginalised are more likely to kind of pay more for those mistakes. So
Mm,
um, again, the importance of inequality here is kind of most people go through these kind of risky behaviours in some way or another, but it works out differently for different people based on their position in society.
exactly. And we'll talk a lot more about or continue to problematize, I guess, the rite of passage. This is not just sort of a natural process that's a developmental. Rites of passage are always fundamentally socially and culturally located. So if you're looking at any so-called rite of passage from a Western perspective, whether it's you know schoolies week or something like that, it will always look different for different people, and it will be I guess, a fantastic way to look at a social and cultural phenomenon. Like a rite
Yeah.
of passage is sort of the ultimate one of those, not to sort of naturalize or normalize it as inherently good or bad, but to look at how the gendered, racialized, classed, all the kinds of dynamics of inequality we're interested in as sociologists, how they are sort of bound up in what that right is and how it changes over time and how the norms within it change. Say, around drinking, women weren't allowed to drink in a pub. You know, 100 years ago or even more recently in some places, and in many places around the world they still can't. So I guess this is a way of showing, again, making the familiar look strange through these
Yeah.
theories.
And whatever the rite of passage is, there will always be a moral panic around it. And it's always kind of, therefore, shows that kind of people have interest in kind of what the good version is and what the bad version is. And those interests kind of advantage some people over others.
Yeah. And I guess antisocial behavior is another framing here. It can always be explored really usefully as a social, cultural, and historical phenomenon. What gets termed antisocial, who is defining it as such, and what kind of behavior are they trying to tacitly demonize through the term? You can see this particularly antisocial behavior is a kind of cat cry of right-wing media, for example.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And offending is a good example of this. I mean, young people don't have their own place to do kind of maybe deviant stuff. They often got to do it in public, because your parents at home and you're hiding stuff from your parents or whatever, and so they're more likely to be caught in that sense, and they're more likely to be represented in this kind of way of, doing these deviant or naughty things or whatever in a way that's kind of adults are probably doing many of the similar things, but they're doing it in their lounge room. And so the place of where this stuff happens is obviously very important in terms of how it's represented and how it's policed and how it's sanctioned.
Mm,
Already spoke a little bit about violence, you know, when violence is and isn't kind of acceptable, and drug taking we always spoke about a little bit as well, the kind of very contextual nature of that. Um, the deviance of drug taking, I think, is a particularly interesting thing to look at in today's society, where like much of the problem drug taking is prescription. People are taking all kinds of drugs that are prescribed by doctors in billion-dollar industries, but it's kind of legit, right? Even though it's probably having as many, if not more, kind of social problems than it would be from, say, recreational drug taking. Um, you can look at maybe why so many people want to take recreational drugs. Like maybe it's to escape from the kind of mundanity and the pressures of their lives, right? So, um, again, from the sociological perspective of this, we tend not to kind of make moral judgments about good or bad, and we're much more likely to try and understand things about why things are happening and who benefits.
mm. And young people's mere presence in public spaces can be deemed antisocial, even regardless of what their actual behaviour is. They're just existing in public spaces can often be termed antisocial, and people call the
Yeah.
police on them just for being outside in a public area, or young people, are forbidden from congregating in malls or shopping centres, which is just a public space where groups of people, of course, are going to meet. So it's, I guess, framed and read in particular ways along those relations of power I've been talking about, particularly around non-white or racialized young people.
Yeah, the invention of the kind of crime of loitering, which is essentially
Mm.
hanging around in a place with other people, right? Is a good example of that. And then you have, in the 90s, malls starting to play like classical music to try and like disperse young people and this kind of thing. And there was even laws in Queensland, for instance, where more than four young people at once weren't allowed to kind of be together. So you could be even having a game of doubles tennis and being like, asked to move on in that kind of instance. It sounds absurd, but these are the kind of things that and kind of sanctions that young people are constantly faced. And young people tend to be the most over-policed and over-regulated group in many ways because they have no power to kind of fight back. They can't vote. No one listens to them. They tend to be the um, seen as kind of again blamed for problems, and they're an easy kind of people to blame.
Yeah. And so that's the end of this particular section in the first lecture, introducing the sociology of crime. And so we'll be back with you to talk about sociology of gender in relation to the course next.